everybody, it's Carter here, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series between writers. And you're probably already wondering why you're not hearing my brand new puppy barking. I had mentioned I'm getting a puppy in my last episode, and that's because I don't have the puppy yet. The puppy comes in, Jesus Christ, 3 days, and I'm already having stress dreams. I'm scared. I'm scared of the puppy, but I'm sure it will be fine. And sleep is overrated as it is anyway. So that's what's going on in my life. And I will say also, I just took a lovely trip with my son. We went to the Southeast and we investigated a couple colleges for him, University of Georgia and the University of South Carolina. And while we were there, we splurged and took in the SEC championship football game in Atlanta, which was a wild experience. So, but it was really fun. It was really fun. So I got my dose of the South heavily in the last week or so, which is great because it segues nicely to the guest that I had today, because my guest hails from Middle Tennessee, born and bred in Middle Tennessee. Today on the show, I had Ronald Kelly. So Ron is a really interesting and cool guy. He's a horror writer. He's a Splatterpunk Award winning author. And he's just been a storyteller for a long time. And his journey was very interesting, right? Because, he grew up in an area where, I think he said it, a college degree is as rare as whiskers on a bullfrog. So he didn't go to college, but he's a self-taught writer, but he always gravitated towards the horror genre, and he achieved good success in the 90s to the extent that he could write full time for a period of 6 years, and then that all kind of fell apart as kind of the horror genre during that time started to get saturated. And he took 10 years off, which is, out of bitterness. We go into that a bit. So it's fascinating. But he is, he's a really prolific writer, and he just recently retired. So now that he's retired, he has a lot of time to dedicate to releasing some of his old books and writing new ones for sure. So, without further ado, I think you're going to like this one. This is my conversation with Ronald Kelly. Nice to meet you.
It's nice meeting you too.
I know we've rescheduled this a few times, and you just recently retired?
Yes, I did.
What were you doing? What was your work?
I was a quality manager for PPG Paints.
Okay.
And, we electrocoated car parts for Mercedes and Honda and some other car companies, So,
had you been planning the retirement for a while?
Yeah, pretty much. I worked there like almost 22 years.
Oh, wow. And
I was ready. I was ready to get out of there and writing full time again.
So have you, and we'll kind of go through your history a little bit, but just, you said again, so were there periods in your life where you were just a full-time writer?
I did write full time in the early 90s.
Okay.
From 1990 to 1996, I wrote full time.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll get back to that. But how does it feel so far?
Feels good.
Yeah.
My kids have got a free chauffeur to school and back.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one thing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's funny because I don't write full time. I have another job, and you have those fantasies, right? Of like, oh man, I'm going to be a full-time writer. It's going to be amazing. But I don't know, because I write an hour a day. So it's like the idea of writing like 3 hours, I think I'd have to build that muscle, because I don't have that kind of muscle. Right. I don't know. Is that what your plan is? Like, I'm just going to 8 to 5, I'm going to sit in the office and write.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
I got to get up my steam. It seems like I've got so many things to do around the house lately.
Right.
Got to get to my writing time, but yeah, that's my plan, is to have a schedule where I can sit down and write a certain amount of hours a day. And
Yeah. I mean, it's a job, right? Like you have to be disciplined, and you have to do it consistently, and it's not always fun. like most jobs. But if you don't do that, if you don't give yourself a schedule, then you end up doing all the things around the house all the time instead.
right, yeah, and binging on Netflix and stuff like that.
Totally. Yeah. That would be depressing. So you're in Tennessee, is that right?
That's right.
Whereabouts?
It's 60 miles east of Nashville.
Okay. Yep. I'm very, very, very familiar with Nashville. Actually, my employer is based in Hendersonville. I'm in Colorado, but I've spent a lot of time in Tennessee. Now, did you grow up there?
Yeah. I'm born and bred here in Tennessee.
Okay. You travel much or not so much?
Yeah, I mean, before COVID, I traveled quite a bit. Me and the family, we actually went out west 2 years in a row, and we actually drove all the way to California from Tennessee.
Oh wow, that's a haul.
Yeah, it was. we rented a van and I think we put like 8,000 miles on it.
Oh my goodness, that's a big. Geez, that's a big trip.
We pretty much
how did it go?
Hit all the national parks there and back. So
beautiful. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Well, that's good memories for sure. Well, that's what a lot of people did during COVID. Actually, those were the places people were actually going. Were like the national. Right. I mean, you couldn't even get into a national park in 2020 and the summer 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what were you doing growing up? What were your parents doing?
My daddy was a tool and die man.
Okay.
I pretty much come from a blue collar family, farming,
sure,
families, and that's pretty much what we did. We worked the factories, and he was a blue collar worker. He was a tool and die man, and my mother was a full time house homemaker, and
so you don't come from a long line of writers.
Yeah. Well, a long line of storytellers. I mean, most of the ones in my family were like, they were just vocal storytellers,
but like people who could just hold court and like spin a yarn for an hour and.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. So do you see that as an influence in terms of, your ability to craft stories and to be creative?
Yeah, I believe so. My grandmother, she was like a master storyteller. She would, I would sit on the front porch for hours, and while the other kids were playing baseball and everything, I wanted to listen to her tell, stories about family history and the Civil War and
oh wow,
ghost stories. About anything that she just had a way of telling a story that. Just kind of sucked you in,
Huh. Right. You get an appreciation not only for the story, but for the voice, right? Like that, that same story could be told in a different voice and not have nearly the impact. So, and I find that's, it's same thing when I'm reading books, I gravitate to the voice and the plot is almost of secondary interest to me,
Uh-huh.
Did you, like, were you writing at all in your childhood? Did you have aspirations to study writing, or when did kind of the bug hit you?
Well, I was always an artist when I was a child, and
a visual artist.
Yeah, a visual artist. Yeah. Like in high school, I did the comic strip for the school paper, and I did my own comic books. And
oh wow!
I actually collaborated with Lowell Cunningham, who he was a fellow classmate, and he went on to create Men in Black. So
wow.
Strange that two Tennessee boys and out in the sticks, kind of did their thing and got a little nor notoriety about it.
Yeah. So what did he ended up moving out to L.A.?
No, no, yeah, I believe he just. I mean, he did the the Malibu comic book. He wrote that, and then actually, he told me about it. He called me up and he said, "Hey, I've sold this comic book series. It's called Men in Black." And at that time, I wasn't interested in comic books anymore. I was more into the writing. I said, "Oh, great! I'll check it out." And I just kind of forgot about it. And then I went to the movies and saw his name in the credits. So
That's crazy. I mean, that's a monster franchise, right?
It is, yeah.
Wow. Well, he probably didn't get the same payday that Will Smith got, but I'm sure it's still pretty cool.
I'm sure, yeah.
And so, when you started kind of writing in earnest, like what were you doing short stories? Were you how did you know how to write?
Well, I began writing fiction and like in my junior year in high school, took some journalism classes and creative writing classes, and got interested in just writing stories. And I began with short stories. I basically consider myself a short story writer. That seems to be my medium, is kind of little short, um, um, little short tales and everything like that. And of course, when I went on to write for Zebra Books, I went on to write larger novels and stuff like that.
Right.
But my grandmother is the one who I pretty much learned my craft by just trial and error. Never did go to college. College graduate in my family was like whiskers on a bullfrog. So,
wow, yeah,
I just I did a lot of reading, studied how people put together the chapters and narrative and all that, and just kind of over. It was actually 12 years from the time I started writing to the time I actually got published. So, in that 12 years, I honed my craft and found my voice, and by the time I started writing novels, I was pretty good at it, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that's a long time to. So we're a little bit similar. It was 9 years for me, and I started writing in my early 30s, but I had zero background in writing, never taken the class. Like I just started doing it, but so I knew nothing. And same thing, like I read a couple books about how to write, but and I guess that was a little bit helpful, but it's just practice, man. And it's practice and it's feedback. And a lot of people, I find a lot of writers struggle with the feedback part. Like they're worried about sharing, they're worried about showing their stuff to anybody. But I'm like, that's the only way you learn. Were you kind of, so like with your short stories and during this 12-year process, how were you getting your feedback, whether or not you were kind of getting better at it?
Well, actually, it's not like it was today. I mean, you didn't have a lot of communication with other writers and
right,
like beta readers, and you just kind of winged it, I guess. I mean, you just wrote stories and submitted them to the magazines and stuff. There was a lot of small press horror magazines in the late 80s, early 90s, and I started about mid 1980s. I started submitting to a lot of the magazines, horror magazines and stuff, and started getting acceptances and stuff like that because I was.
So that was your feedback. Either it was binary. You either got accepted or you got rejected.
Right. Yeah.
That's all the information you had.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the way it was back then. It was a more isolated process than it is today. I mean,
right. And you were physically, mailing your stories out.
Yeah. We had to physically print up copies and mail them out with the, pre-postage envelopes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it was old school writing back then.
That's how I was when I was looking for an agent, because that was back in like 2003. So I was mailing query letters out. And I would think about, like, is this nice paper? Are they going to like this? You think about all that stuff, and now it's just a press of a button and it's submitted. But that's also caused like a lot of, competition, and a lot of like would-be writers are just throwing their stuff out there, and it just these agents and these magazines, I'm sure, just get overwhelmed with submissions. So it's a lot tougher. What was drawing you? Because I read in your bio you kind of flirted around with like mystery, science fiction, and Western fiction, and you kind of ultimately gravitated towards horror and suspense. What was that kind of mindset like for you? Was it just something that was more interesting to you? Did you have maybe a stronger voice in those genres?
Since I was a child, I was always gravitated to like monsters and weird things and stuff. I always like to tell the story that when my mother was pregnant with me, my father was in the military, and she was living in a little rental house, and she went upstairs and found a whole big stack of those old EC horror magazines and Tales from the Crypt and
right.
And she brought that big old stack down and read them the whole time she was pregnant with me. So
through osmosis.
I wouldn't be surprised if I did absorb some of that from the womb. So,
yep.
Because I always had that interest in horror and weird stuff, and when a part of it has to do with my grandmother telling me the ghost stories and stories about really weird, strange people and stuff like she'd encountered over years, and so for years I wanted to be a Western writer. I wanted to went to different genres, but when nothing else seemed to click, I went back to my first love. I went back to horror and all that, and it clicked, and so
it clicked in terms of how you felt writing it, or in terms of actually publication success, or both, I guess.
I have to say both, because it was something that I really enjoyed writing, and I seemed to be pretty good at thinking up kind of offbeat ideas for stories and novels and stuff like that. And,
right.
And one thing, I was writing about the South. I was writing stories set in the South, which at that time, just about the only ones who were writing Southern horror was like Joe R. Lansdale or Robert McCammon or Carl Edward Wagner.
And Anne Rice, I guess, to an extent. Yeah.
I guess so, yeah. And so these little small press magazines I was submitting to, they had a kind of a hunger for that. It was something different from what other people were submitting. So.
And the South, and I speak a little bit from experience, and in fact, my son and I just got back from a trip to South Carolina and Georgia, where he's looking at some schools there. The South lends itself so nicely in terms of its geography to horror, I think, because it's lush and the air is so thick, and so like it just has that gothic vibe depending on where you are. So it lends itself great to those kind of settings, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the woods. You get out there. When I was a kid, we used to go out and roam in the woods, and it was just like you're in a primeval world or something like that. And it could be a little spooky, if the sun started setting and you wasn't home yet, and you was out there in those woods. It was a little scary.
So, are you more interested in kind of the fantastic, monsters and things, as opposed to kind of more realism horror?
Yeah, I think so. I do write psychological horror and stuff like that. Serial killers and true crime. I do do that, occasionally. But a lot of my books are, monster oriented. Like werewolves, vampires. I've done
Okay.
a zombie
Right.
novel.
So you're submitting stuff in the 80s, and I see here you sold your first story for $20, which is actually in 1988. That I'd be like, damn, I sold a story for $20. I mean, that's weird, right? The first time somebody actually pays you, like a company, for your words. I remember when I sold my first book, I'm like, somebody's buying this and they're giving me money. It's such a weird feeling, but it's still not a lot of money. So um I assume you have some kind of job that you're supporting yourself during this time when you're writing, but it sounds like you get into the 90s. Tell me about how it came to be that you were able to support yourself writing for several years in the 90s.
Well, I got pretty popular in the small press magazines, and at that time, when you got sort of established and got a name for yourself, you wanted to go on and write, mass market paperbacks. I mean, that was your goal back then. It's not necessarily how it is nowadays, but yeah. And I got an agent. I got an agent at Scott Meredith Literary Agency in New York City, and I wrote my first novel called Hindsight and submitted it to them, and they shopped it around for like two and a half years. Mm-hmm. And I always like to tell everybody that it went from, they probably went down the alphabet from A to Z because they ended up at Zebra. But then Zebra, they accepted my first novel, and then it wasn't like 6 months later they accepted the second novel, and then they started offering me multi-book deals.
Wow.
And so that's how everything went into play about, give me the freedom to write. I mean, it was pretty much a steady job, just writing books.
That's crazy. So, and were they giving you a multi-book deal for a series or just for standalones?
Just standalone books. Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually I would sign a contract for 3 books, and then I'd write those 3 books, and then they give me another contract. I think I went through 3 multi-book contracts.
Okay. So you were churning them out. How long was it taking you to write one of these books?
Probably about 6 months.
Yeah.
Zebra liked the big doorstopper books. They liked, there was a stipulation in your contract that you had to write a 450 to 500 page book. So that was a little stretch sometimes. Sometimes, like my first 2 books were like 200, 250 pages. And then when I started signing multi-book deals, then that the big books were popular back then. Nowadays, people, their attention spans aren't as long as they used to be.
Yeah.
And they like the little novella lengths. So
yeah, it is true. Yeah, my books tend to be 85,000 words, so it comes out about 400 pages or so. But I have a lot of like single sentence paragraphs and and short chapters, and that's just how my voice and my style is, and that's what I like. But I get so much feedback that people like that, and I think it's, to your point, they have short attention spans, so they don't want to get weighed down by 3 long paragraphs describing something. Right. So they just want to know what's going on. But it lends itself well to how I write, but it's also kind of depressing. But yeah, back in the 80s and the 90s, for sure, it was all about, you look at Stephen King and, some of his massive works coming out then. And I loved that stuff, because I had no money back then. So I would look for the fattest books I could find, more bang for my buck. And so I gravitated to all the unabridged version of The Stand. I'm like, 1,200 page, bring it on.
That's a big one. Yeah.
So you must have been thinking, and I'm always fascinated by the industry of writing, right? Because it's pretty brutal, and it's so full of ups and downs, but it's mostly full of downs. So but in the 90s, you've got this like system where you're just churning out books and you're getting 3-book contracts time and time again. Did it feel at the time like, okay, this is just how the rest of my life is going to be, I guess?
Yeah, pretty much. I thought I'd be doing this for years and years and years, because at that time horror seemed to be very healthy and popular, and of course behind the scenes it wasn't as healthy as it seemed to be, and
Hmm.
there were problems mounting that I wasn't aware of. I thought I was going to be with Zebra for a very long time, and it didn't turn out to be that.
So what ultimately happened with them?
Well, in the mid 1990s, horror, it was like the publishing industry was so oversaturated with horror and a lot of bad horror. I mean, a lot of like Zebra was part of the problem where they would just put out so many books at a time, and a lot of them wasn't very well written, and hopefully mine was a little better than some, but um, you know the readers were buying these books and getting burnt, and they stopped buying as many books as they did, and the publishers got in trouble and started cutting authors and started cutting their horror lines, and
Yeah.
that's what happened. That's what happened with Zebra. They 1996. I remember it. It was October the 9th. It was my 9/11. So I got
What
a call.
actually happened on that day?
I called my I was waiting for another multi-book deal, and Zebra wouldn't give it to me, and I was kind of confused about why that was happening, why they were giving me the cold shoulder, and my agent called me and he said, "I got news for you, but it's not good news." And he told me that Zebra had shut down their horror line, and that was pretty much all. That was my job, and I actually had 2 more books on their schedule, and they returned them to me, and any advance money that I made, I got to keep, but I was out of a job.
Yeah, and it is crazy how that and especially back then, right? So back then there was no self-publishing. So if horror becomes popular, then the publishers start chasing horror, and maybe they're not really caring as much about the quality from some of the authors. They're just trying to get it out there. So they kind of made their own problems, right? Because now I feel like there's so much competition against with self-published authors, and there's no control over the quality of that, and they kind of saturate the market sometimes as well. But back then, it was the publishers were putting these authors out that are maybe lesser quality, and that affects everybody, the better writers as well. So what was your next move after that?
Well, I asked my agent, I said, what can we do? Can we go to another publisher? And he said, no, no editors are reading horror now. It's kind of, got a bad name to it. And so he gave me a bit of advice, and looking back, it probably wasn't, I probably shouldn't have bought into it, but he told me to write anything but horror, So I went to other genres. I even tried writing children's books and stuff like that. Nothing clicked. I got very frustrated. I got very bitter, and I just quit. I quit for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
I didn't write anything for 10 years. I didn't read any horror for 10 years.
You lost your passion.
I did. Yeah. I thought, well, I got my shot, and it lasted a while, and then, it was gone. And so I just went back to the factories and just continued for 10 years, raised a family, with my wife, and had health insurance for once, so.
Well, which is huge, right?
Yeah, it is. And
especially with the family.
So yeah, for 10 years, I pretty much just hung it up.
But that's so interesting to me, because in talking to all these writers that I've interviewed over time, one thing that I've noticed is that if you are a writer, whether you're writing or not, it's going to come out. It's, no matter how much you might do to try not to be a writer, if you are, it's going to come out. And I see it time and time and time again. So it's interesting to me to talk to somebody who, actively shelves that whole part of their life, even though I think naturally that's probably who you are. What was the rebirth experience?
Well, the whole time I didn't write, I still had ideas.
That's just it. You can't shut it off.
No, you can't. You really don't. And I would be at work and I'd write down little ideas on paper and I'd put it in a coffee can. And I actually found that coffee can a few months ago. And
oh wow,
it's packed full of ideas. So
good ones.
I don't know, probably good and bad, but I may dump that out and see what's in there. It might give me a few more years writing to do, but I had a friend and a fan, and he kept wanting me to get back into horror. He would come to me and say, "Hey, there's this new guy, Brian Keene, and he's wrote a zombie book, and it's revitalized the horror industry." And I said, I'm not interested. I had my shot. I just don't want to do it anymore. So he brought me some signed books back from convention, and they were signed to me, and they were all from authors who seemed to know who I was, saying thanks for the inspiration and all that. And I thought,
wow,
did I really do something that was, lasting like that? That probably that might have made some people want to, give it a go in this genre and all that. And so, it was 2006. I decided, well, if I'm going to do it, I need to, just, put away the bitterness and the gun shyness and just give it another go. And I announced I was coming back, and it was just like I never left. It was just, I had a whole body of work to fall back on. I had 8 zebra novels that, I could republish, with other publishers and stuff like that. And a whole lot of short stories, maybe 150, 200 short stories that I could make collections with. So that's how I started, in 2006. I came back and started making my work available to people again.
But then at some point, then you actually started physically writing again as well.
Yeah.
What was that like? Was that like, because what I'm kind of fascinated about with you, Ron, is that you left writing out of bitterness, which I can totally picture, because like sometimes you get into a rut where you see, your friends really making it big and you're like, what am I doing? So I think bitterness is a very hard thing to overcome, right? And then to get back into it and to rediscover, the actual joy of writing. When you actually physically started writing again, were there kind of demons there that you had to battle against, or did it just come naturally and flowed?
It just came naturally. I mean, it was like, I guess, like I say, like riding a bicycle, and it was just. And it seemed like I could almost write better than I did before, because maybe I needed my creative batteries recharged, in those 10 years, because when I came back, I just, it just seemed to flow, and it seemed to be very natural. I mean, I kind of put all that bad angst and stuff behind, and just went back to work again and started writing.
And the market had changed, obviously, in that time as well. And when you look at, especially like movies and TV, I mean, horror, maybe even starting with like Blair Witch kind of sparked something that all of a sudden, kind of took off into a lot of new, and even like, you think about like the Twilight series and things like that, just Supernatural really started like taking off. So did that kind of coincide also with your kind of reemergence as a writer?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. And, slowly the indie publishing scene really started blossoming, and I mean, today it's just it's phenomenal. There's so many great writers coming out, in horror through the indie presses today.
Yeah, for sure. Stephen Graham Jones is actually, he lives right near me, so I've had and I just went to StokerCon because that was here in Denver, and I write dark psychological suspense that's kind of, people have said, tinged with horror, however you want to define it, but yeah, I mean, that conference was packed, and I think there's a real appetite for horror, and I think horror, like, spans a lot of different things, right? Like it's kind of hard to describe, but you could have slasher all the way to like just very mild kind of ghost stories that aren't necessarily even scary, but they're horror in a way. Something I want to ask you about, just because I saw, you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but I saw it on your website about your Twitter feed is on your website. You made a comment about, it sounds like you're very active in your church, and it sounds like they recently kind of turned their back on you because they found out you write horror.
Yeah.
What's that all about? Like, how did that manifest itself?
Well, actually, the new book, Southern Fried Horrified, had something to do with that, because I've been, a member of this church for 22 years, and they knew that I wrote, and they pretty much knew what I wrote, and nobody had a problem with it. And then, I kind of went public with this memoir, and we had a big write-up in the local paper and all that, and it just people changed their opinion of me. It was like, oh, hey, this is for real. He wasn't just toying around with it, because I'm a pretty private person in my community. I don't I never did make a big deal about being a writer or anything, but when I started promoting Southern Fried and Horrified, I did they did a write-up in the paper about it, and they actually had a big electronic billboard that came up.
Oh, wow.
We had a big book launch at a local, it's redone train depot. They renovated it and all that, and so I had my book launch party there. So it seemed like the more public I went, the less my church they didn't like it very much. So
yeah. And first of all, no writer should be ashamed of what they write.
No.
And secondly, like, you have to promote. Like, that is part of the job. Like, you can't just not tell the world that your book is out because you need to sell copies. So it's, that's a tough spot to be in if your community is not behind your writing.
Yeah, this is a little small rural community, and everybody has certain preconceptions about what the kind of people who write horror and all that.
Right.
But I found that people who write horror are the nicest, most decent.
100% horror and thrillers, the nicest people. And I've heard people say romance writers are horrible human. I have no idea if that's true, but you're right about the preconceived notions, because it is important to be part of that community as well of writers. And the more I've gotten to know thriller writers, I'm like, these are just the nicest people. Maybe we're all just like kind of, writing as a form of like our therapy in a way, and getting stuff out.
I mean, the writers I know who write the most extreme stuff, the most extreme splatterpunk stuff, are usually the most well-adjusted, nicest people you could, I guess they get rid of all their poisons and everything by putting on the written page.
I think that's probably what it is, but it is also frustrating because, no matter where you are, people have preconceived notions about, oh, if you write this, you must be like this. And and the big one obviously is like the cliche of like, you only write what you know. And nobody's giving you credit for, an imagination. And, if you were writing what you knew, you'd be in prison, obviously.
Yes.
But people have that, they think like, why are you so dark? What happened to you in your childhood? You're weird. And it's
why don't you write something nice? They always saying, why don't you write something nice?
Right, because nice is boring. I don't know if I know how to write nice. But
I'm hardwired for hard. That's basically what I tell them. That's what, that's how I think, that's how I create, and that's what I write.
But and the whole other side of that too is that you're still telling a story. You're not just saying, scene after scene of splatterpunk slashings. So when I write something dark, it's because I want my protagonist to go through that and come out the other side. And to me, they're all very hopeful stories, but there's a lot of struggle involved, because I find struggle interesting. So I'm sure your stories are still full of hope and full of achievement and perhaps happy endings. I don't know, but people don't ever think about that. They just immediately label you as like, you're just this dark weirdo.
Right. Yeah, that's very much.
So did you you no longer attend that church?
No, we're looking for a new one, but I just can't. I don't like to be judged. Nobody likes to be judged.
Right. And that's. I'm sure you can find a church where that doesn't happen, but I mean, that's in a very small community. I'm sure there's challenges with that as well. But well, that's good. I'm glad you're not changing what you write.
No, I'm not.
So, and just as we wrap up here, as you now, you're kind of assuming a new life after retirement. Do you have contracts in place, or do you have goals about, I want to write this many books a year, and here's, what we're going to try to do with them?
I've got kind of a schedule of what I'd like to do in the next 5 years. I've still got several of the Zebra books I hadn't put out in paperback. We're slowly re-releasing a lot of them, and I'm actually my magnum opus, Fear. We're putting out a new author's preferred edition of that.
Oh, wow.
And I'll be starting on the sequel to Fear, probably, it's first next year, and I'm looking forward to that. And because Fear is about 31 years old, so or maybe not quite that much, maybe 28 or 29, but that's been a long. That Fear seems to be the book that everybody gravitates to, that they relate to. So I'm going to write the sequel, and so I hope it turns out well.
Yeah, that's always interesting to revisit kind of an older book and then to craft a story attached to it, because 30 years ago your mindset was totally different, right? And you don't want to be exactly how the book that you had before, but I think about Stephen King with Dr. Sleep, following up. I mean, more than 30 years from The Shining, and it's a totally different kind of book, in my opinion, at least. But it's just interesting to see how people's, patterns change over time. So that'll be a good experiment to see what your follow-up to Fear, how it comes out relative to the first one. Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do a quick storytelling, speaking of. So this is the fun part. I've got 3 books here that I kind of picked out at random, and you're going to choose one of them, and we're going to choose a random sentence, and I'm going to read that sentence, and that's going to be the first sentence of like a 2-minute long short story. I'll read it, and then you give me a couple sentences of maybe what happens next, and then I do a couple sentences, and we'll just see where it goes. Okay. So I've got a Larry McMurtry book, Sin Killer. Speaking of Western writing, Tana French's The Searcher, and Lars Kepler's The Mirror Man. Speaking of horror. So choose one of those.
Let's go with the McMurtry one.
Okay. And then give me a page between 1 and 250.
Let's do 125.
Okay. And give me a sentence between 1 and 10.
7.
Okay. Right. All right. So this is a very basic sentence, and you can go anywhere you want with this. A moment later, he was proven wrong.
He slowly stepped off the boardwalk of the saloon, slipped the thong off the hammer of his gun, and faced the man that he had been hunting for the last 20 years.
The man was so different than he expected. He had dreamed of him so many times and saw him perfectly, but the man standing before him looked nothing like what he envisioned. He wasn't strong. He was scrawny, emaciated, hair long and kinked, falling well past his shoulders. And he didn't have the anger in his eyes as he'd expected. There was fear. He almost pitied him.
The man facing him shuddered as he stared at him with sad eyes. I hear you've been looking for me.
The bounty had only grown over the past 20 years. And he knew he could bring him in dead or alive. He could shoot him right here like a dog, right in the dirt, and still collect all that money. But in the moment, he didn't know if he had it in him anymore.
Yeah, he said, I've been searching for you, but that was a long time ago. Sometimes anger eats up a man. Sometimes it drives him for years and years looking for things that when he finally finds them, just doesn't seem to be the same thing he started out with.
Oh, I think we call it there. That was great. I totally pictured that. Like the idea of like you, the ultimate kind of trope of like the chase is better than the kill, right? Of like you finally get there and you're like, this isn't what I expected or what I want. And I always think that's an interesting theme to explore. The division between expectation and reality. So, well, listen, man, it was great talking to you. You're a very fascinating person, and congratulations on not only the retirement and the foray into full-time writing, but all the production and all the success with your books. And I'm looking forward to seeing more and more come out. Thank you, Carter. I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Enjoy the rest of your week. Take care, Ron. All right. Thank you. Bye. So that's it. That is my conversation with Ronald Kelly. He was fantastic, and I loved the storytelling we did at the end. I could very much visualize that as we were doing it. His new book is Southern Fried and Horrified, so I highly encourage you to check that out if you are if you have a bend towards the horror genre. And if you want to learn more about him, please go to his website, which is ronaldkelly.com, and you can find out a lot more about him and his books and his appearances and all that kind of stuff. And if you want to find out more about me, just go to carterwilson.com. So that's it for now. More episodes coming out soon. As always, I really appreciate you guys either listening or watching this. So take care.